Chapter 8. Two become three. With new information of the immediate threat buzzing around their minds, the duo bid farewell to Cal. Geely was genuinely amazed at how casual Kai was as they watched him slowly descend back into his boggy abode. Even though Kai clearly maintained a distance from Cal, there was a familiarity between them that can only be formed over many years. Cal seemed to simply dissolve into the very earth itself. This man was an enigma, perhaps not a man at all. Even Kai showed apprehension towards him, so Jilu's eyes had certainly experienced only a fragment of his powers. Kai was upbeat, knowing his old acquaintance was still on their side. Allies were clearly hard to come by. The dangers that Jilu had encountered over his brief excursion into the real world had both scared the shit out of him and opened his eyes. They gave him courage he never knew he could mine from deep within his soul. "So we make for the city of Well, then?" said Jilu as they made their way back downstream. "In time, I suppose we must venture to that city, lad, but look for no welcome in that realm. They cast out anyone who they declare an enemy of knowledge," replied Kai. Still musing on the warning from Cal, Kai looked on with a sullen expression. Yet he also looked ready for anything, moving now with the vigour of a much younger man. "What is our route?" asked Jilu. "Do we head all the way back down the course of the River Santic?" Kai did not respond. He just slowed his pace. He held his left hand out by his waist as a warning. "Quiet now. Our friend is back on our trail." "Where?" Jilu replied. "Hush!" Kai hissed back at him. This time their pursuer appeared to be on the same bank as them. Jilu couldn't figure out which direction the spy was observing them from. Without warning, Kai sped off into the woods, his sword drawn, moving like lightning into the dense foliage. Jilu quickly lost sight of Kai in the vegetation. With a loud shout and a thud, Kai exclaimed, "Laddie, get the fuck over here!" Jilu bounded into the greenery and encountered Kai with his knee across the throat of a skinny, pale man. The mysterious man was dressed in a simple brown-stained cloak, tied at the waist by a ragged cord of string. His boots were ripped and split. It looked like they were either the wrong size or perhaps even worn for a long time. His hair was matted into thick thatches. A wispy, dirt-clogged beard hung off his bony chin like spider webs. Due to his emaciated face and lack of body fat or muscle, it was nearly impossible to age this pathetic specimen. Now fallen, approximately 6 feet away, was a blunt knife with no handle. This must have been what both Kai and Jilu had seen glint in the sun from across the river. Kai had transformed from a rather world-weary traveller into a ruthless warrior, with his sword at the assailant's mouth, crossing his lips from cheek to cheek, pressing into his face. He looked into the eyes of the spy with a pressing intensity, flashing his teeth with his face flushed red with rage. Jilu looked terrified at the side of Kai he'd seen before, when he unwittingly sung the Can song. Kai was justifiably paranoid of strangers. However, this seemed to be fueled by an intense rage that seemed like it rose from a much darker place within him. "So we finally meet, my invisible friend," Kai said with an evil smile and flared nostrils, his eyes wide and white like piercing torches illuminating his prey. "So what is this spectre of the forest case for following our path for so long? Talk honesty, or die as a liar." His sword still crossing his anonymous stalker's lips, he released the pressure slightly to allow the man, who now quivered in fear, to answer. Then the sword suddenly made a quick return to his scratched face. The spy suddenly evacuated his bowels in absolute fear of his imminent demise. Kai leapt to his feet in disgust. His sword still drawn and hanging over his prisoner, he lay crying in a pathetic shape, curled into a fetal position, grabbing his knees to his chin, shaking in a pool of his own disgusting digestion. "Oh, you filthy fucking animal! What sort of foe promptly shits himself at the first sight of a blade? What kind of man are you?" Kai reacted, now completely enraged at his waste of energy on such a weak adversary. Kai walked back about 10 feet after realising there was no immediate danger. He sat down on an upturned tree trunk to catch his breath and also to get upwind. Jilu, you ask him who he is. I can barely stomach being near him right now. Kai spat impatiently. What am I supposed to ask him? Jilu responded. Just think, lad. You spotted him following us as well. Kai had never been this impatient with Jilu before. Although he knew little about interrogation, Jilu wanted to show his friend that he could be useful. He drew the dagger given to him by Kai and stepped forward. Breathing heavily, Jilu instantly regretted this. The smell hit his nose like a right hook. He gagged slightly. Right, he muttered. The secretive spy had said not one word as of yet. He looked in fear at yet another possible enemy. Look, speak quickly, or I will send my acquaintance back to question you instead. Jilu started more with hope than experience to see where this exchange would lead. Suddenly a shaking voice finally emanated from the soiled spy at last. I'm Nez. I'm not trying to kill you. I was told to follow you. They said to protect you, but I am useless. Look at me. A puzzled Kai stood up with his sword still drawn, looking almost insulted. Who sent you? Who in their right and sound mind would select you as a fucking bodyguard? Nez let out a loud bellowing cry and tears streamed down his cheeks. He tried to get to his feet, but slipped unceremoniously in his own feculence. He twisted round as he fell and dropped right into a puddle of liquid shite face first. Laying still in unconditional surrender to his predicament, Nez sobbed with his shoulders bobbing up and down in a depressing rhythm. Kai stood up and walked back towards Nez. For fuck's sake, get on your feet, will you? Have some dignity in yourself, whoever you are. Kai looked in sheer disdain at this half-alive excuse for humanity. Nez turned his face away from Kai, ashamed, shit running down his forehead and mixing with his tears. Oh, for crying out loud, exclaimed Kai as he tore a segment of his tunic and threw it at Nez. Wipe your face, will you? Tentatively, Nez obliged and cleared the slop from his eyes. Now tell me quickly who sent you, who's your employer and why. Kai added an addendum. Do not fucking stutter. He raised his sword along with his now hoarse voice. Parla, said Nez in a half-whispered voice. Kai sprung forward and lunged at the unsuspecting spy. He threw a punch that knocked him clean off his feet. Nez was left unconscious back in his fecal pond. This time Kai had no sympathy for him. He raged and sputtered, chipping splinters up the surrounding trees with an uncontrollable flailing sword blade, babbling an incoherent rant that Jilu couldn't make any sense of at all. Kai whirled in circles like a windmill in a gale, spitting at Nez and cursing his name in garbled words. Jilu took up his wooden spear and thrust it into the path of the wayward sword blade. The sword cleaved it in two with a shattering clang that echoed across the valley. As the final splinters fell into the leaves of the valley floor, Kai stopped swinging. His eyes locked with Jilu's. It was the first time he looked upon him with any sort of threat. In silence, he stood as still as a statue carved from pure experience. Gone was his rage now. His warrior instincts kicked back in. With the broken shaft of his wooden spear left in his grasp, Jilu knew he could not match any blade, regardless of it being in the practised hands of Kai. Throwing the broken weapon down, he spoke with a steady voice. Kai, my friend, I am not your enemy. Neither are the trees, for fuck's sake. Stop this and tell me what has brought you to this rage. Kai looked slightly ashamed and inhaled several times. His face ceased to be a simmering vessel and began to return to a normal skin tone. In frustration, though, he flung his sword down to the ground, only inches from Nez, now lying in a heap. Crouching down, he held his head. Jilu saw a torrent of tears rolling down his cheeks. Kai sniffed and spat out the taste of his sorrow and rose to his feet. Laddie, with reactions like that, you could get yourself cut in half. But I am sorry. Kai sighed. When this scum opens his eyes, he has one sentence to speak, then one of death to receive. But what is his crime, Kai? Who is Parla? Jilu frantically inquired. Kai flew back into a rage and abruptly fell silent again. Sorry! Sorry, Kai shouted. You were not to know, laddie, he added in more contemplative tone. With glazed and reddened eyes, he looked at his still unconscious Nez. Parla, he paused and took a deep breath. She was betrothed to me. My black-haired, passionate love of my life. We were to be married and truly besotted with each other. Not one dawn has passed over many years that I awake without the pang of regret for what could have been. I also breathe my last each day in silent worship to my lost bride. He broke down into an intense bout of uncontrollable sadness. The tears that poured from his eyes could have flooded the Santic all over again. Jilu let his troubled companion vent his despair and sat by his side, his hand on the back of Kai's head. Thank you, lad. Not many people could delve that deep into my armour. Kai stood back up and paced back and forth. Parla was mine and I was hers for many years. Under the order of the moon we were to be married. From infants we chased each other's emotions. We fell in love from our first heartbeats in our chests. Tell me what happened, Kai. Tell me and trust me as a friend, Jilu asked quietly close to Kai's ear. Kai hesitated for a brief moment, then responded forlornly. She was killed. Killed because of me and my selfish loyalty to my order. Now Kai started to pull up the grass under the leaves in a pained manner. When my order was dissolved, she was held captive. A ransom was ordered to draw me out of hiding, and they wanted me to claim her. But I knew we would both be certainly killed instead. Kai pointed to the knife he gave Jilu. This was to be my wedding gift to my beloved, laddie. Jilu had no idea that this blade held this significance. I'm honoured, Kai, Jilu proudly said. If I'd have known this, I could never have accepted this as a gift. Kai patted Jilu's shoulder. You can help me shoulder this burden, lad. How did Parla die, if I may ask? Inquired Jilu. She was held in a village jail outside the city of Well. I returned incognito to see if a rescue would be possibly arranged. I arrived in the town square to see her standing on a gallows. Before I could even blink an eye, the lever was pulled and she fell. They beat the rest of her life out with clubs as she dangled at the end of a rope. Kai dropped his head once more and looked at his feet that weren't fast enough. His shoulders slumped as though he was carrying her body on his back. Nez began to awake from his abrupt slumber, his nose and mouth streaming blood. His tunic resembled a bandage. Kai looked at Jilu, searching for his approval to dispatch Nez for his lie. Jilu shook his head and whispered, Listen to what he says, Kai. He might be useful to us. Kai, without replying, stood and picked up his sword. He stomped towards Nez, and his knuckles whitened as his fist clenched with a slight trembling rage. Tell me, how does one gain a contract from that who is dead? Kai pointed his blade at Nez and continued. Speak! Tell me another fucking lie. Tell me how a woman now rotted to dust can command a pathetic stain such as you. Nez stood up and looked back at Kai, His knee decided to develop a tremor that soon reverberated around his body. "My message is this," Nez started. "Dearest Kynoch, my child of love and life I trust, come to me, my adoring moon spell." "No one calls me Kynoch. How do you know this name? Who gave you this name?" Kai's blade raised once more, now ready to execute this blasphemer against his lost love. Nez simply reached into his blood and shit-stained clothes. In his hand he now grasped a lock of hair as black as the night sky and as shiny as freshly spilt blood under the moonlight. Kai's sword blade dropped to his side and then fell from his hand onto the ground. He moved towards Nez with uncomfortable shuffling steps, his hand held out, desperately in need to caress the past.